everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mark Whedon. Dr. Whedon is a Hittitologist, senior lecturer in ancient Near Eastern studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and the chair of the London Centre for the Ancient Near East, whose Twitter handle he runs. He kindly agreed to come and talk to us about paleography and the influence of Sumerian on Hittite literature. Mark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. Could you give us a little bit of background about yourself and explain how you got into this field?
Well, I've always enjoyed reading ancient languages, really. It's a bit of a complicated story. How long do you want me to go on for?
As long as you want.
I did a degree in Greek and Latin, and then I decided I really didn't want to be an academic at all. And but
Good
then
choice.
tried to build up a non-academic life, but completely failed at that. So came back to it about 10 years later in my early 30s, and I think I'd bought a book on Akkadian. That was it. And I saw they did Akkadian and Hittite at 𝀭S, so I thought I'd go up there and do an MA. And it haven't looked back since.
It's stuck.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you've researched during your career has been paleography. Could you explain what paleography is to people who might not know?
Yeah, sure. Well, paleography is essentially the study of historical handwriting types, I would say. So, you know, you can do manuscript paleography, particularly it's usually done with things like English manuscripts or whatever. And the idea is that people have certain styles of handwriting at certain periods, and that you can date manuscripts and that kind of stuff, and say things about the manuscripts and how they were written on the basis of paleography. So it's quite important in cuneiform studies as well, I think, although it hasn't really been studied until quite recently very much. There was a lot of study of paleography done at the beginning of cuneiform studies. Everyone was writing long sign lists because that's what they were interested in, is how many different forms of this particular sign are there? You know, there just seems to be so many of them. We were all overwhelmed with it. And then people sort of forgot about it for a while, and it's come back in the last 15 years or so, I think, especially with the digital technology, which has become really important in making advances. But yeah, one of the most important things, I think, what makes paleography important to me for cuneiform is that it is the direct evidence we have for what you might call streams of knowledge transmission, or, you know, who's learnt from who, where have they got their information from, that kind of stuff. So for Hittite, particularly Hittite cuneiform, it's of great interest to try to work out when they've adopted the script. Have they got it from northern Syria? What kind of Syrian traditions are they getting it from? What are the influences that are coming in through the history of the script and that kind of stuff? Where are they coming from? And these aren't kind of conceptual ideas that you're just thinking in your head or whatever. What ideas, or what goddess is being syncretized with what other goddess. It's concrete things that people are writing in the clay that you can actually see, you know, and it's not a matter of question, does this look like this other thing? It does. So it's a really materialistic way of looking at the transmission of knowledge, and that appeals to me.
So when you're looking at paleography of cuneiform, what kinds of points of data are you looking at? Is it the graphic form of the shape, or how the wedges are impressed on the clay?
Yeah, those are all really important things. So I mean, what we're finding is that well, it depends what questions you're asking, basically, but the graphic form of the sign forms will show you, for example, in the Hittite example, whether an Assyrian sign form is being used or something like that. At some point during the period of during the Hittite history of Hittite cuneiform, they start importing Assyrian sign forms, and that's obviously to do with the kind of cultural contacts that are going on. More interestingly than that, actually, we found that probably the first level of these imports is Mitannian sign forms, and in fact, the Assyrian sign forms are Mitannian sign forms themselves, which was quite an interesting new perspective. So that's the sign forms. Yeah, the shapes of the signs, absolutely. That can tell you an awful lot about what's happening, and but also, as you say, the way the signs are written on the clay, the order the sign, the strokes are made in order to construct the signs. These kind of things, although it can be very difficult to establish them, are incredibly important for establishing, if we can do it, it's very difficult to do, communities of scribal practice. So not just where the traditions of writing are coming from, but maybe even identifying the identity of scribes. But it's just extremely difficult to do that with cuneiform.
That was going to be my next question. Can you identify like individual hands of scribes?
Wow. Yeah, that you know, when I first got into this, I thought, yes, that's what we're going to be able to do.
Definitely.
But no, it's really not worked out like that. So I think one of the most promising projects that was done was this 𝀭Support paleography. Oh no, I forgot what it's called now. 𝀭Support metrology, that was it. So cuneiform measuringness, whatever, science. And that was so this was a project done by Würzburg and Frankfurt, and it was like information technology people and cuneiformists, and they got together this app called Cuneiform Analyzer, which analyzes 3D images of manuscripts, cuneiform manuscripts, and then it's possible to do things like analyze the angle of impression and that kind of stuff, and the way that angle relates to the angle of other impressions of other wedges. And it's at that sort of really deep level, that sort of really unconscious level of like how a particular scribe writes this upright, and then there's this wedge coming on here, and it's at that angle or whatever on this particular sign. It's at that kind of really unconscious level that that there is some sort of possibility of identifying scribal hands. And what they're doing with this project is trying to, so I think the project's over now, but Michele Camerasano particularly has written some very interesting work on this. But I think the further way they're going is trying to identify joins, particularly. So you've got, particularly in the Hittite archives, all the tablets are smashed to pieces, and you've just got little fragments, and establishing which slabs, as it were, which fragments use which sign forms at which angles and that kind of thing. Humans can't do that. It has to be the computer doing that, essentially. And that's the way forward, I think, that's happening there.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So previously people would like look at the shapes of the different fragments and say, oh, those two are joins, but presumably when you have so many fragments and some of them, I'm assuming, are very, very small, that kind of human analysis is just either not possible or would take too many years to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's also the fact that well, I mean, it's also going to take very many years to do this, because it's these things all need to be 3D scanned, and that takes a long time, basically. But yeah, I think this is where the real possibilities for paleography are opening up. Although there is plenty of room for the traditional approach as well, I'm absolutely sure.
So you've spoken briefly about how you use paleography in ancient studies. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that? About
how I use paleography?
Yeah. Or how it can theoretically be used.
How it can be used. Well, yeah. So paleography can be used to, as I say, to illustrate where knowledge is coming from. So one project I was involved in that unfortunately didn't get as far as I wanted it to was trying to establish what kind of relationship there was between the oldest level of Hittite writing, so Hittite cuneiform, and the writing from Alalakh level 7, which is about, I don't know, 50 years, maybe 100 years before the oldest level of Hittite writing. And usually we say that the Hittite writing is very similar to that from Alalakh on the basis of the sign forms, because, well, Hittite writing is essentially Babylonian, and that used at Alalakh level 7 was also Babylonian. So I've spent a long time in the museum in Ankara, and also in the British Museum, which has some of the Alalakh tablets, and in Hatay Museum, looking at this material, and it's just very difficult. I'm afraid one doesn't need. You can't just stop at comparing the sign forms, as I was just saying. You have to develop a global approach to looking at it. So you have to look at the shapes of the tablets, you have to look at the way they're being written, the kind of context they're being written in, what they're being used for, and stuff like that. So just looking at signs, cuneiform signs, much as I love it, and that's why I got into the subject, because it's so fascinating, all these cuneiform signs and whatever, isn't enough. You have to take the whole social context into consideration and consider not only the genres of the tablets, but what are they being educated to do? What kind of education system would there have to be there for these kind of writing practices to evolve? And these kind of global questions are the ones that have to keep being asked. One thinks, for example, that you get, like, the Assyrian Empire's got very, very regular script, hasn't it? And this is kind of the script of empire, where you don't get a lot of changes happening between one generation and another, whereas you compare that with old Babylonian script, which is all over the place. There's sign forms everywhere, and you can generalize from that to the kind of society that people are living in, or at least see it as one reflection of the way societies and education is happening. So this was one of the difficulties I had with comparing the Alalakh material and the Hittite material, because they're basically completely different social phenomena.
So when you're looking at specifically Hittite cuneiform, are there signs that only occur in Hittite, or is it a much more close relationship to other forms of cuneiform?
Yeah, okay. It's basically Babylonian cuneiform. It's basically Babylonian cursive, sort of, not as opposed to monumental, not the stuff that you write on statues and public inscriptions and that kind of thing. It's Babylonian cursive that they use. There's a few signs that the Hittites have added to it, just a couple, but what they've done with the Babylonian sign forms is they've regularized them. So yeah, as I was just saying, old Babylonian, you can get 3 different sign forms for the same sign within 3 lines of cuneiform text. But for the Hittites regularize them. So, for example, like, oh dear, where's my whiteboard? For example, if you imagine you've got a sign that's got like 1 wedge in it, or it can have 2 wedges in it, or it can have no wedges, no vertical wedges in it. Well, and you can have, it doesn't really matter in Babylonian whether your sign Shah or your sign Ta has 2 wedges or 1 wedge, or vertical wedge, or none. In Hittite, they standardize it so that the sign Shah has 1 wedge and the sign Ta has 2 wedges, and that's the way it is always. And so it's kind of a standardization process that they've gone through, which is quite interesting, and also says something about the kind of educational background or state organized, possibly, background that's happening here with the adaptation of the Babylonian script.
Do we know much about Hittite educational systems?
No. Yeah, okay. So they've got all over the Middle East, they use these things called, in the ancient period, they use these things called lexical lists, which, basically lists that you have to learn at school. And so we've got lots of evidence, and you do them on practice tablets, and there's they're usually sort of little lenticular, they're called, aren't they? Little circular practice tablets. And your teacher writes a little exercise, and oh, very nice. Yes, there we go. That's one. Yes. And your teacher writes an exercise, and you write one on the back, or you've got 1 in 2 columns where the teacher writes one and you write a bit. And we've been able to reconstruct the curriculum and all that kind of stuff from all these tablets that were found in Nippur and all the rest of it. So that's Mesopotamia. Once we get to Hittite Anatolia, there's none of this. There's absolutely no practice tablets. Well, okay, there's possibly about 4 or 5 possible examples. But they do have the lexical lists. So there's plenty of the lexical lists in the Hittite archives, but they all seem to be more the kind of more complicated, difficult end of the curriculum. So the ones that you learn when you've been learning for cuneiform for quite a few years, as it were, or really quite esoteric things that that Erim Hoosh, for example, very complicated list that is that we still don't really fully understand, or things like Diri, which is a list about how you form complex Sumerograms. So really the sort of upper end of the curriculum. And it's like, I think 𝀭described it as a postgraduate curriculum they've got there going on. But that means we don't have any evidence for how they're actually learning to write. So we don't have all these little bits of clay with loads of stabbed wedges on them and that kind of thing that you get from Mesopotamia. Maybe they were just better at throwing their stuff away than the Mesopotamians were. I don't know. But those things that we do have evidence for, well, we think might be practice tablets, they're something very, very different. They seem to be, I don't know, there's a letter, there's a bit of a medical text. Also unclear whether it's a practice tablet or a collective tablet. But they all seem to be a couple of stages on from just beginners work. And sometimes we think this because there's lots of copies of literary texts there and all these annals. I mean, goodness, they just go on and on. And you think possibly people are learning to write once they've got to past the basic level, using these literary texts and things like that they can remember or whatever. And given that Hittite copies are quite often pretty rotten, it's possible that is the case. But again, we don't have the school contexts, so we don't have a building that is a school where you can say, right, this is the detritus from school exercises and stuff like that. So people must have been using this stuff to learn how to write.
Interesting. To go briefly back to the use of Babylonian sign forms, do Hittite people use the full complement of cuneiform signs, or do they do like what the old Assyrians did and kind of condense it down to a smaller subsection of signs?
I'm going to have to get my Borger out now, aren't I? Yeah, right. No, they use the full complement. Well, I can't remember that. I can't remember the numbers now. But yes, pretty much. So yes, I mean, if I just open what's his face here, right? No, they don't use that one. So all right. So there are quite a few signs. There's there are quite a few signs that they don't use. That's quite true. So quite a few logograms and stuff like that. A lot of the things that, for example, that obviously the stuff that comes in after the 2nd millennium BC, they're not going to be using that. But they've got a remarkable they've got a remarkable repertoire. I'll say they standardize things like Shart versus Tar. What they also really like are these signs, like where you have the sign for mouth, ka, and you put the sign for bread inside it, and it means to eat. They love that. So they've got all sorts of stuff going on there. They expand those kinds of signs, actually, those kind of combination signs. They like them, and always, although it's not always clear why they do that. But yeah, it's not complete, I'd say. So I'd say there's what, 300 and I don't know how many actually. Maybe
but it's
about
not like
400.
they've taken several hundred and condensed them down to 50 or so.
No, it's not like Assyrian, like you were describing. Yeah, because like with the old Assyrian, you know, they just use about 80, don't they? And it's mainly syllable signs.
Yeah.
So phonetic signs, very few logograms. Whereas the Hittites, in the earlier texts, it's mostly phonetic signs, syllable signs, but in the later ones, it's much more logographic. There's much more logographic writing, but that's the same as you get in Mesopotamia as well around that time. So, you know, if you talk about around 1500 BC, well, in let's just say in Old Babylonian, it's a lot less logographic than in Middle Babylonian.
So, one of your recent publications, I think it was a 2020 chapter, was the influence of Sumerian on Hittite literature. How did the Sumerian language influence a culture that was so far removed in time and space?
Yeah, well, that's the title I was given by the editor, and I said okay. That's why I put it in inverted commas.
Excellent.
But so the answer is they didn't, basically.
Fantastic.
But obviously Sumerian, you know, which dies out around 2000 BC, is really important for the whole of cuneiform culture. And you know, if you learnt to write in Babylonia, you learnt Sumerian essentially, or you had to learn something approaching Sumerian. But in line with what we can see throughout the second millennium BC, Sumerian becomes less and less a language that anyone understood, and more a language for really hiding meaning, and you know, the language of the gods kind of thing, the language of the inscrutable signs that the gods give us to tell us how the world's going to be. And Sumerian becomes a lot more academic, and it's essentially based on the language becomes more and more based on these lexical lists. And you see this happening in Hittite as well. They're using Sumerian texts, but they're using them in a similar way to the way they were being used in Mesopotamia, I'm pretty sure. So that we don't have a great many Sumerian texts at Hattusa, but those which we do have, especially in the 13th century BC, seem to be being used in a kind of hermeneutic, investigatory fashion. Like, how can we explore the meaning of this Sumerian text and create a meaning that applies to our situation, kind of thing. So we have to this hymn to the storm god, which is trilingual Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite. There was one manuscript we used to think was bilingual, just Sumerian and Hittite, but a join's been found which shows that there was actually an Akkadian version. But what the Hittite version of it is doing is not paying any attention to the Akkadian. It's skipping over that, and it's playing around, word playing with the Sumerian and trying to tease new meanings out of the Sumerian by kind of like a word association and things like that, which is sort of what happens in Oman literature throughout the history of, or certainly more and more through the second millennium BC in the whole cuneiform world. So they seem to be doing something really, really similar to what the rest of the cuneiform world is doing with Sumerian. They're using it as this kind of treasure trove of meaning, as it were, that they can excavate into and bring out new meanings that will obviously be of importance for composing hymns and praising the gods in the way that they need to be praised, I suppose. So that's how they're using it. On the other hand, right at the beginning of the transmission, so in the old Hittite period, there are some Sumerian incantations, And again, I'd imagine this is, well, this is obviously this very complicated language or whatever, and if we want to have some incantations that are going to be effective, then we need to have them in the original language and that kind of thing. And they seem to be collecting in incantations that that address themes that aren't addressed by their own literature of incantations. So they're very interested in this this so-called Marduk-Ea formula, which is where Marduk or Asaluchi, the Sumerian form, sees something that's wrong, and then he goes up to the god Enki in Sumerian, Ea, god of wisdom, and says, "Oh, what shall I do about this?" And then Ea says, "Well, you know what to do. I can't tell you anything." And then tells him what to do, and then he goes off and sorted it out. But anyway, so they seem to have been very interested in this because they didn't have it, but they never translate it. So it's like they've collected this in order to say, they must have connected it in order to use it. So they're not using Sumerian in just an entirely academic fashion. There is a use context for it, absolutely, as well, I'm sure, and presumably that meant that they would be using it in Sumerian.
That's very interesting. When you're looking at Hittite writings rather than Sumerian that has been kind of collected, do they use Sumerian logograms in Hittite?
Oh yeah, Hittite texts. Yeah, they use so a basic Hittite text, a line of Hittite text will have elements in Akkadian and in Sumerian and in Hittite.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So when you learn Hittite, you don't just learn the Hittite language, you have to learn basic Akkadian. Sumerian, not so much. I mean, it's unclear that they would have actually known what Sumerian was, even though they're doing all this highfalutin translation and stuff like that. We have no evidence that they knew the word for Sumerian. But these logograms, Sumerian logograms, are presumably a way of writing Hittite words, just like they are in Akkadian. In an Akkadian text, you have Sumerian logograms that are used to write Akkadian words. And it's possible that they're using them because it's a simpler way of writing, but sometimes it's not simpler. Sometimes these Sumerian logograms are a lot more complicated, and that's presumably them showing off. But you've also got Akkadian going on in most Hittite sentences, and the question there is, are they being pronounced, as it were, in Hittite? Or is it a much more complex reading and composition process that's going on than we understand? Perhaps, we tend to think of reading just being in one language, but why should it be? Really?
That's fascinating.
I'm not sure about the Sumerians. I mean, so I'd say the Sumerian is probably just logographic, so just writing Hittite words, although it could be writing Akkadian words as well, and a lot of the Sumerograms have Akkadian phonetic complements. So yeah, I mean, it does seem a bit as if Akkadian is part of the written idiom, as it were.
So these are obviously very, very highly educated people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were in Mesopotamia as well.
Yeah.
But you just don't get the kind of same social context for cuneiform among the Hittites as you do in Mesopotamia. So if you think of the famous cases where you've got that house that was excavated at Sippar Amnanum, and it's the the house of the incantation priest or whatever, Urutu, whatever his name is, and and they're hiring a scribe there to come and do the writing and educate the kids and that kind of stuff. And that's a sort of it's kind of jobbing scribe or whatever it's going to have been. You just really don't get that kind of material among the Hittites. They don't seem to be using cuneiform for this kind of purpose. So they do tend to use it for this more rarefied sort of thing, sort of more rarefied scholarly sort of stuff. Although a lot of the literary texts are absolutely not what we would call scholarly, but but yeah, presumably they are quite educated, and a lot of them have got Babylonian names, especially at the beginning. And some people say, oh, that's because they're Babylonians or Assyrians or whatever. I just think it's because they're pretentious. Some of the names don't make a great deal of sense. But anyway, but yes, letter writing, that's a bit of a different thing. I imagine that quite a few of nobles and stuff like that might have known how to write a letter, but they don't know Akkadian generally. There's even one letter where some magnate or whatever, general, whatever it is, says, yeah, I got your letter, and I was going to write back, King, but I don't know Babylonian, so I couldn't read it and I threw it away. Yeah, or at least that's my interpretation. But anyway, so there we are.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we're going to take a very brief break now. If you have questions for Mark, please put them in the chat. We will not be taking questions when we come back from our break. So now is the time to get them in. Josh, that's your cue. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back to answer your questions. Thank you very much, everybody. We will start off with super chats. Fran Wilson asks, how many Scribal communities have you identified?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, of course. And I've not done that much identifying myself, I have to say, but it's so the scholar I'd recommend here is there's a couple, Shai Gordon, his name is, and he's written, I've forgotten the name of the book now, Hittite Scribal Circles, I think it's called, something like that. And he thinks that there were basically like two offices that were operating in Hattusa in the 13th century, and they're kind of competing against each other, and they're writing different kinds of texts, and they've got different sort of branding going on, using the paleography business, using the sign forms and that kind of stuff. They're using slightly different kinds of sign forms or whatever. One of them's got a bit of a more in the colophons, which are the little bits at the end of the tablet saying so and so wrote this, and it's this composition and that kind of stuff. Sometimes they write some nice archaic Babylonian sign forms and that kind of thing in one group, but not so much in the other. So he's got these two groups of scribes who are working at the same time, it seems, and have different affiliations in the same place in the Hittite capital. And so there's quite a lot. That's absolutely fascinating. His book. That's one example of communities of scribal practice. I think that's really very interesting. And what's that? Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of ramifications there. My stuff has more been about like with looking at Alalach and looking at the kind of changes that happen in writing practice, and whether it's to do with new population groups or whether it's to do with people speaking a different language. Perhaps later on they in the 17th century or whatever, they speak Akkadian, or they seem to be writing Akkadian anyway, and later on they're writing Akkadian but with a Hurrian accent and that kind of thing. And what kind of changes happen on that kind of level. But when you spend your time looking at original tablets, you can see groups of tablets that were clearly written by, it must be the same person. I know I earlier said that you can only use electronic means to identify this kind of thing, but the experience of sitting there, for example, with the Alalach, what are they? The troop rosters of Alalach, very, very sort of boring texts, and that's why not a great many people have worked on them, apart from Eva von Dassau. But they're if you sit there and look through them, it really looks like, with the exception of one or two, they were all written by either people who were trained in the same school and also in a very short space of time, or by the same person. So it's when you look at the original texts, it can be quite enlightening to think in those kind of terms.
Thank you. We have had stickers from RAF4 and from Tessa. Thank you both for your support. As ever, we appreciate it. Reginald O'Donoghue asks, what do we know about the Hattians, the non-Indo-European Anatolian people who lived alongside the Hittites? Did they use cuneiform too?
Hello, Reg. Yes. All right. So the Hattians. Well, did they use cuneiform? Well, okay. So we know we know the language Hattic, right, which is referred to sometimes in the Hittite texts, and they say that this is Hattili. They say it's what follows is in Hattic. So you have these Hattic phrases in Hittite texts, and there's a couple of completely Hattic texts, and there's some bilinguals as well. And there's also a what's called the Hattic cult layer, as it were, which is like a layer of cult, which usually involves particular gods and goddesses and particular rituals that all seem to have their origin towards the beginnings of the Hittite kingdom, empire, whatever you want to call it. And some people think that there were Hattic speakers, so that you have a bilingual Hattic community living in Hattusa, or at least in parts of the central area of Anatolia, at least for, say, the first, I don't know, the 16th century, 17th century as well. Unclear whether one should actually call them the Hattians, as in a people or whatever. But yes, there are people obviously who were speaking Hattian, and their texts were obviously very important for the Hittites. So yes, I would say if we can call those people Hattians, then they were presumably using cuneiform in the same way as the Hittite scribes were at the same time. If we can follow the indications that there was some kind of bilingual community going on in central Anatolia at that time. Now, the more traditional explanation is that the Hattians are, as it were, the 𝀭 folk or something like that of central Anatolia, and they were there, and then the Hittites come along and interfere or whatever. I'm not sure how far you can say that these days, but for example, traditionally it's thought that the remains of the royal graves at Alajuhuic and that kind of thing, which date to about 2100 BC, that they are Hattian. Again, that's a hypothesis. I'm not going to say it's rubbish. I just wouldn't want to put an ethnic name on those archaeological remains in that sense, because we don't have any cuneiform writing basically for that period. So it's not a matter of whether people were using, certain types of people were using cuneiform writing, or ethnic groups were using cuneiform writing. I think it's a matter of whether there is a culture of cuneiform writing in a particular place at a particular time.
Thank you. Ben Lamoureux asks, did the Hittites introduce the storm god versus the sea dragon motif to the Levant and Mesopotamia? It's all over the ancient Near East by the Middle Bronze.
Yeah. Well, I love the Hittites, so I wish they did, but I doubt it. So I think what we've got there is, you know, this storm god versus sea dragon. What we've got there is an aerial motif that's all over the place, isn't it? I don't think we can really establish exactly where it comes from. I mean, there are certain cult locales that are very important. So you've got these Mount, what's it called, Hatsi, and all the rest of it down in what's it called, the 𝀭 and that's clearly, these were sort of cultic places that were very important in this story, and you know, you get them being passed on in Ugarit and stuff like that. And I don't know that we can say that it's the Hittites that are responsible for it, but we can say that the Hittites are at least transmitting versions of this same story, that, well, or a similar versions of this story that are making their way around the area. The Hittite versions are quite interesting. The 𝒀₀ story, I think, is what you might be referring to. And we've got two versions of it that are presented on one tablet, which are quite different stories. And Amir Galan has pointed out that that this seems to be a kind of etiology or an explanation of why a particular ritual should happen in a particular place. And they're using this kind of serpent against the storm god mythology as a reason for explaining why a particular festival, I think, should happen in a particular place. So it has a kind of political dimension, the narrative as we find it on those Hittite tablets on which it's preserved. So yeah, it's got quite a different context among the Hittites to what you might find at Ugarit and in Ugaritic and stuff like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Rayfall says, what is your favorite Hittite text or collection of texts, and why?
Yeah, they're all my favorite. So well, okay, you can't, I don't know, just shut me up when you need to. No, what I really love is the Hittite building rituals. I suppose I've been looking into them quite a bit recently, because I've been working at this site in and on the western Kızılırmak River with the Japanese Institute of Anatolian Archaeology, and they've been digging there for a number of years, and we found this incredible deposit, basically. This sort of like underground shaft, which has all sorts of luxury items that have been deposited in it, and it seems to be a foundation ritual. So I've been getting into reading those, and what I really love about the foundation rituals, especially this one particular one, KUB 29-1, we just call them all by numbers. It's ridiculous. And in this, you get the king, and he has a little chat with the eagle, and then the eagle goes out and has a look what's going on and that kind of stuff, and then the king has to persuade the throne, because the throne's made of wood, to go and intercede on his behalf with the trees on the mountains, in order to persuade them to allow themselves to be cut down by the king, so that he can build his palace. And it's the most extraordinary, surreal story that is told in the context of this foundation ritual. And a great deal of the Hittite rituals have this sort of nature element that is really, really wonderful. But otherwise, you know, and do you have figures like the stag god and stuff like that, which is so wonderfully represented in hieroglyphic, these huge stags, antlers and stuff like that, usually rather boringly translated as protective deities, but they're stag gods, and it's all very nature and mountains and that kind of thing, and you just can't not like it. And then there's things like well, from the political side, I think you can't beat the apology of Hattusili III, which is basically his excuse for, or apology for, defense, let's say, for having usurped the throne from his nephew. And basically God told him to do it, or the goddess Ishtar told him to do it, you know, and he wouldn't have been successful if he hadn't been in the right. And you know, that's an argument we've heard before, I think. But yes, so Hattusili is absolutely wonderful. The 𝀭letter I would also recommend, which was also probably by Hattusili. Hattusili III definitely has his own style. He's inimitable, and I can imagine he was quite an annoying person to know.
Thank you. Anna Demars says, what was the number system used by the Hittites? Was it the same as the Babylonians?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh no, that's a little bit. That's a little bit complicated. So you mean the sort of counting in 60s and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, no, I think so. They do. They use the same. They use weights and measures that often have the same names. And yes, you do get the sort of you know, the similar kind of construction of numbers and that kind of thing. But they do have their own weights, you know. So like so the mina in Babylonia is 60 shekels, you know. That's the standard thing, and among the Hittites it's 40. I'm not quite sure why, but it is. So yes, they basically have the same kind of number system, but there are some changes. But weights and measures is what I'm talking about there, and there's also, yeah, so measurements of fields and stuff like that. So they have their own stuff going on there. So they haven't transplanted the metrological system from the Babylonians, but they're using quite a bit of it. There's a good article by Theo van den Hout on this, in the kind of encyclopedia of Assyriology sort of thing. And what else would I want to say? Oh yeah, well, talking about the kind of genres of texts that they have among the Hittites, you know, I mentioned they don't have the practice tablets for the lexical lists and stuff like that. One thing they don't have as well is mathematical texts. So they, for some reason, they weren't interested in these. There's quite a few types of texts that they weren't interested in. They seem to have only taken the types of texts that they were interested in. So they don't have the mathematical text with all the kind of like experiments in measuring fields and that kind of stuff that you get. We do have lexical lists from Hattusa that have lists of fields and stuff, but you know, we don't don't get the metrological stuff, and it doesn't appear to have been part of their interest in writing, basically, I suppose, because they're not training people to be professional scribes in the sense of jobbing scribes, as I was talking about earlier, who'd be going out measuring fields and whatever. They're training scribes to, well, be a bit more arty-farty, I suppose.
Thank you. Raphael, again, I'm saying that wrong. It's Raphael. I'm sorry. How much of Greek mythology comes from the Hittites? Is Kronos a PG-13 of 🀭, or do they both have a third older origin?
Oh yes, a PG. Yes, 🀭 and Kronos and all that kind of stuff. Again, I would hesitate to say that this material is coming from the Hittites. I would say 🀭 and the 🀭 cycle and stuff like that is actually North Syrian, Hurrian kind of thing. And what we've got among the Hittites, among the Hittite tablets, is this version of what's called the kingship in heaven story, or the song of emergence, as we call it nowadays, because a scholar called Carlo Corti actually discovered a colophon in which the name that they gave to it was preserved, written with a lovely logogram that they constructed for the purpose. Yes, so the Song of Emergence, whatever, this kingship in heaven cycle with Kumarbi and all the testicle devouring that goes on there and that kind of stuff. This is essentially coming from the Hittite kind of area. That's from the Hurrian kind of area in sort of northern Syria, I think. We used to think that this kingship in heaven was sort of a translation, but from a Hurrian original, but I don't think we think that anymore. I think we think it's a kind of a Hittite composition that's based on Hurrian material, as it were. So this is all aerial stuff, I would say, that's spread around. And one of the reasons why we think that is because we've got versions of the Hurrian language kingship in heaven myth, so Kumarbi stories and stuff like that, that are preserved at 𝀭Support, and they seem to be different, although they're very fragmentary, to the main Hittite language kingship in heaven one, which is extraordinary, but seems to be being composed probably strongly relying on Hurrian influence, or whatever you want to call it. I don't like that word so much, like to put it in inverted commas, but tends to be, it is probably a local adaptation dealing with local Hittite interests. So particularly what's it called, Mount Hatsi and the other mountain, Mount Nani and Mount Hatsi, so they're down the bottom of the Amarnas, that sort of area, Jebel Akra, blah blah blah, can't remember the name of the other one. And these are the mountains where the kind of storm god cult is situated, and the Hittites are very interested in these mountains, and it's quite possible that they had two cults of the storm god at the one of their temporary capitals, the city of Sapinua, and that's possibly the storm gods of these two mountains which are in northern Syria. And I would say that that's where this kind of mythology is situated, and the Hittites are kind of adapting it for their imperial purposes. So so I wouldn't say the Greek mythology is coming from there. I'd say the Greek mythology is feeding on what's going on in northern Syria and around that kind of possibly Adana as well. So you also get, for example, in the hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions from the as late as the 8th century, we have Kumarbi appearing in those as well. So it was clearly something that, and the ideology of Kumarbi being the mother of the storm god, not the father, but the mother of the, despite all the testicle devouring that he does, he's actually the mother of the storm god, because he gives birth to the storm god out of the good place, wherever that is. And then he's referred to as the mother of the storm god in a hieroglyphic inscription from the 10th century, from Arsus, which is in the Iskenderun area. So clearly this mythology of Kumarbi and all the rest of it is really tenacious there, and I'd say that's where it's rooted, your sort of Iskenderun, Hatay, northern Syria kind of area, and also Hurrian, basically, sort of northern Syria places. So I'd say that's where the Greeks are feeding on it from, rather than from the Hittites. Hittites are what we've got is basically the Hittite view on that kind of stuff, and they're interested in it because they're interfering imperially with it.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. No question from Lucas Cantor, but he sent a super chat just to support great scholarship, which we appreciate. Thank you very much. And we are almost at the 1 hour mark, so we are going to leave it here. Thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to them. We had a lot of excellent questions today. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. This is an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Of course. Everyone, thank you for watching. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.